Hello and welcome to the next part of Project Ensis. Now, funny one here, it seems that 2020 has really caught up with me this week, so it not only broke my CNC machine, which is now awaiting a new ball screw, which could be anywhere between 2 to 3 days or 2 to 3 weeks, we just don't know. So that's messed up that front. And this is also not the first time that I've recorded this introduction. In fact, I did a full one before starting the mod. Yeah, but it turns out that the microphone crapped out part way through. So when I'm doing it, obviously at the moment I'm doing it to the camera alone. And normally what I do is a audio test and I make sure that everything's working fully, and it was. However, part way through, it's basically decided that it didn't like it any longer and has crapped out. So most of the introduction has very weak audio. And the funny thing is, I tested it on the camera and it sounded fine. Put it onto the computer though, and basically it sounds so muted and terrible that if you amplify it enough, it turns it into some kind of Transformer dubstep remix, which is no good. So we're going to be doing a voiceover and trying to cover some of the points that I did in the original introduction, but it will of course be a little bit janky. That said, you know, you've got to make lemonade, and it's just, you just got to laugh at this point. Either way, I'm doing this from the end result of doing the motherboard mod, and we've got some pretty cool stuff on the way. So obviously we've got a Z490 Waterforce and we want to make it fit our sort of lighter theme. And I was really interested by some of the comments. So everyone seemed to like the idea of either a very, very dark kind of high contrast build or the lighter one. There are actually some really interesting ideas for Damascus steel. Unfortunately, I have literally no ability to work with Damascus steel because none of my tools are really set up for working with steel currently, but that's a really cool idea. It could maybe work out for something in the future, so I will definitely shelve it. But for this one, we're going to be keeping it a little bit more standard, so you know, the aluminiums and plastics that you're used to, but I'm hoping that I can make the form more interesting. That's assuming I can get my machine working, but more on that later. Now obviously we need to focus on the motherboard, and I did some concept renders a couple weeks ago that you may have seen pop up on the AORUS Twitter feeds, and of course also on places like Reddit. And they actually did really quite well, and I'm rather happy with the finishes on those. So I'm going to be going with that lighter aesthetic, going with a sort of a silver look. I did consider going white. There was a clay render that some people did think was just like a whited out version of the motherboard. No, it's just not having any of the shaders fully applied. Issue with going full white is that you have to paint all the parts. And actually, when you look at fully white painted motherboards, because they haven't come out of the factory like that, they tend not to look that great. Because remember, PCBs have a texture to them. So when you paint them, actually everything looks a little bit lumpy. And personally, I've never seen a white painted motherboard that I think looks good. In fact, there's a reason I have never done a painted motherboard in a tutorial for BitTech, because I don't think it looks very good. You might disagree with that, but that's where I stand. So I don't plan on doing that. Instead, I'd rather work with what it has and instead rework, say, the materials that are already on the board. So looking at the heat sinks, the covers and things like that, trying to theme them to what I want to achieve. So I want to go with the silver look, which is pretty interesting because there's some cool stuff on the board which should work really well for that. So let's dive into the old intro with the voiceover, and then I can talk you through it all.
Whoa, let's fast forward through that. Okay, so this part has fared a little bit better than the last one, so just bear with me. The volume is crap, but it's still something.
PCB here, this is how it turns up in the box. And as you can see, it's largely naked, but it does have a few things around the outside that we have to consider. So firstly, the I/O shroud here is made of molded plastic. So that means we have to be careful about what chemicals we use to clean it up, as well as the fact that this is going to have to be painted. It can't really use another process. These parts here, though, are aluminium. They're going to have to be painted or stripped, actually. I think I'm more likely going to strip the anodizing like I've done in previous videos. It's a very simple process, and then maybe go over them with bead blasting to get that sort of nice sheen that I've been using a lot in my recent projects, and I absolutely love it. However, swap to the back, and we have ourselves a steel backplate. And because this is steel and fully painted, we'd either have to strip the paint off this and sort of do it raw, or we'd want to paint over it. And I'm thinking it probably would be a better idea to paint over this one, because stripping it runs the risk of doing all sorts of other damage to it, because I don't have all of the paint strippers to do this chemically. Some of them are quite strong. So I'm thinking that will be the best approach, and also this is basically not going to be seen. So some of the more advanced finishes might take a very long time, but I'm not sure if they're necessarily going to be worth it in this case. However, the main bulk of this motherboard, and the bit that you really want to see, is the water block. So let's have a look at that now. Now I did say in the last video that this thing is an absolute unit, and it really is. It actually tips the scale at almost 3 kilograms. I had to measure it just to find out. And most of that comes from this enormous copper base plate on the back here. And that's pretty cool because it covers not only the CPU, but also the VRMs and the chipset. And whether or not that makes a real difference is up for debate. However, for cool factor, I think that's pretty up there. And it's always nice to see a massive block anyway. On the front though, which is what you're going to be looking at, there's a lot of stuff to play around with. So namely, we've got these M2 heatsinks over here. Now these are made of aluminium. They don't actually come into contact with the coolant. However, being aluminium, it does mean that I can strip them. So I'd very much be interested in maybe stripping the aluminium components, which again, we just use with NaOH, it's nice and simple. And then depending on how the finishes come out, I might want to bead blast them, which will then have some matching parts with over here on the board. And I think that'll look really good, especially when combined with the sort of light acrylic, which has a nice frosting on the backside to get the light sort of nicely diffused through it. Now, the interesting thing about here is by going to the natural silvers, I think it'll work really nicely with these brushed components, because these are sort of a gunmetal grey, and this is the same color that's found here on the GPU. So I'm thinking if I leave that one the same color as it is stock, I should do the same here and instead just make these parts lighter and then leave these nice shiny black bars. I think that'll look really good. Now I did consider making some white acrylic covers for some of these parts here. However, obviously with the CNC out of action, that's not much good. Now obviously some parts I could have done by hand, but the thing is you then lose the ability to do things like really polished chamfers and little details that are sunken in like pockets, which I think would really add to it. And doing it by hand, I think would just end up not quite getting the finish that I'm looking for. So instead, I'm going to work around that limit and try and just take these parts, finish them to how I want them to, and then we'll have a closer look and see how it comes out later on. But before we do that, we obviously need to take this all apart. So let's get on with that, and we'll have a closer look once most of these components are on the block.
Once again, I do apologise, the audio is terrible here. However, it's worth sitting through if you want to mock me later on for calling everything aluminium.
Not only are there so many parts of the water block, but also the number of screws connecting everything together. That's going to be an interesting exercise, putting them all back in their correct locations. I've done my best to put them in proper labelled spots, but you know how it is. Sometimes you end up with just one extra one at the end of it and you start fretting going, oh my god, where's that going to go? But we'll cross that bridge when we get there. In the meantime, let's take a look at some of the stuff we've got on here. So we've got the back plate, which has some nice thermal pads on the back, so it actually does do something, which is quite nice. But that, because it's steel, I'm probably going to be painting. But I did start to have some second thoughts about that idea. I was thinking maybe I might be able to strip it. Problem is there are lots of recesses here, and that might prove a little bit difficult. But we'll see when I get around to doing that. Big surprise that I was very happy about. Now I knew this one was metal. I thought this one was aluminium the whole time, as I mentioned earlier. But I didn't know that the I/O shroud was also aluminium. There's not really much of a reason for this to be aluminium, other than, I guess, pure bling factor. But definitely is, and that will make things much, much easier. In fact, I'm looking forward to seeing how that comes out when properly stripped. So I'm going to do the same old NaOH stripping for this one and this one, and I'm also going to do the same effect for some of the other aluminium parts like the M2 heat sinks over here, as well as these little sections that are sort of diffuser covers and stuff like that for the water block. Now, some of these other bits I'm not so sure about, so I'm probably going to leave these diffusers alone. because actually I think that these are pretty colour neutral, and it would be a better idea to just have them pick up the existing colours on the board. I will say one thing, whenever you have to remove these from a motherboard or a graphics card, it's always a little bit antsy because you sort of have to heat them up just to make sure that the adhesive on the other side softens a bit. But the problem is they're on acrylic quite often, or other ABS and things. That's easier. On acrylic it's quite difficult because obviously this expands when you heat it, and it's got screw threads in it, so you've just got to be a little bit careful that you don't overheat the acrylic because it really does expand quite a lot. So you have to just make sure you get enough just to weaken the adhesive, and then you can pull it off. Now it was easier on this because it's metal, so that definitely helps, so I could heat it from the backside. But normally that's a little bit of a tricky one, and it certainly was a little bit risky on some of these parts over here. So one of these pieces, so this is a piece of steel, and then this one here I had to heat up just so I could get the sticky pad off, and that's on top of just acrylic next to more acrylic, so it's more of a matter of just blasting it with a bit of heat, laying off, blasting it with a little bit more heat, and then it did come off quite easily as a result, so that's pretty good. Now I was thinking about leaving this sort of piece of steel here alone. I don't know, I'm thinking the shape could look quite nice if sort of, I guess, brushed down, and I can always give it either a beaded finish. I think it should work, and if not, I could always polish it up or something similar. We'll see when we get there. I might always just leave it alone. It does look really quite nice as is, but there are a couple dings on things where I'm not entirely sure why, so I might go over that. We'll see. I'm leaving things open because so far I've made mistakes, and I'd rather just do it right the first time. The block itself, with all the parts removed, is actually quite interesting. I mean, there is an argument to be made for cleaning all this up and actually just leaving it as is, because that's quite interesting. The only problem is that the RGB strips are on the front and they're diffused by this metal plate over here. So if you did want to do that, you'd probably have to cover them with something else or just get rid of them entirely, which would be a little bit of a shame, and it would leave a sort of a channel down the middle, which I don't think would be such a good idea. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep them and then go with a slightly more stock orientation with the panels. I think that will be for the best. But now we've got a bit of a plan going, let's get to it, get some of these parts here painted, other ones stripped, and then the other bits just nicely bead blasted and finished. So in the meantime, why don't we just cut to a nice montage of me smoothing everything over and getting the job done. I think we're going to need a bigger container. So you know what's quite funny? Remember those covers that I said were aluminium for the motherboard? Yeah, it turns out they're not. In fact, they're probably die-cast zinc, as we've once experienced before. Because I put them into the solution and absolutely nothing happened, and it wasn't just paint, it's literally the metal itself. So, funnily enough, they look exactly the same. However, what I did do is I wanted to see how strong the surface finish was, and so I put it into the glass blasting cabinet, and I've come out with this. And I think that looks really rather good, because what's cool about this is that this isn't a paint effect, this is the raw metal itself, and it has a much sort of deeper luster to it, which I think looks pretty good. And this is the sort of finish that I was hoping for anyway, so the fact that it's a slightly different colour to the aluminium, if anything, adds to it, because zinc is deeper, it's got a kind of a more like steel finish rather than the very light finish of the aluminium. In fact, you can actually see the difference here. We've got aluminium in this little bar here that I didn't feel comfortable extracting, so I left it in there, and that's gone slightly lighter than the surrounding metal. So that's quite interesting. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to take this one and then I'm going to glass blast it and sort of get it into the same finish as that, which should look rather good. and then I'll see how the other finishes go later on. But for now, let's go do that. Unfortunately, I haven't got my camera set up ready for that yet. It's still going through this incredibly dark panel, so just going to use your imagination. You know, for a bit of a wildcard gamble, I'm pretty happy with how this one came out, because there was no guarantee that it would actually come out just like the renders, and it is alarmingly close, especially considering I thought some of these materials were completely different when I started off. So remember I said this was plastic? Nope. And then I said it was aluminium? Nope. So now we got all the way to probably being zinc and die cast, which in itself meant that I had to change all my processes and rethink a few things along the way. Now I did consider maybe painting it, but see, the problem with painting is, of course, you have to refinish a lot of parts around it. This is a very complicated shape, which would have meant sanding and lots of different edges, and I don't know, I may not have been able to get the right finish with it. But what I really like about this bead blaster finish is that this is real metal, so it may not come across in the video as clearly, but in real life it has a really interesting look, because raw metals are quite different to a painted finish. So when you see it, it kind of changes with the light and it plays with things a little bit. Similarly, this aluminium is all bead blasted, so it's nice fresh aluminium, no painting. And a real surprise, this steel plate down here, I noticed that was steel when I took it off, so I was thinking, okay, I'm probably going to have to paint that. But then I thought, okay, let's just hit it with the glass bead setup just so I can get the original paint finish off there. And what you know, it basically turns into this one. So as soon as it looked at that, I was like, nah, don't need to paint this. This looks just right with that, especially combined with the little accents, and it just pulls it all through together, especially when combined with the memory. So if you recall, we had the Designare memory in the last part, so that's now been swapped out for the RGB sets instead. So that should align better with the lighting in this one. The others look nice as well, but I think these do fit in incredibly well, so we haven't lost out on anything there. I think they're going to tie in really nicely when the lights are on, and especially with all these accents over here. So all in all, really excited about this one. Unfortunately, I didn't have the chance to get the GPU done in time, mostly because of these zinc parts over here actually. If they were aluminium, they would have all stripped in a few seconds in the solution, and then we'd have just been able to blast them quickly with the beads. But having to go over, it took hours going over and over and over to get a good finish, and unfortunately that took the time out of the parts that I was going to do for the GPU. So instead I'll just put that in later on in the video series, and that'll be fine. I'll basically match it up with this. Now that I've got some of these processes done and I know how things look, it should be quite simple to do that one over there, because it's just a matter of painting and then doing a little bit more stripping. Now, one thing I'm a little bit concerned about is the status of the CNC machine, because obviously I'm still trying to sort out the ball screw on that, and that could be anywhere from 2 to 3 days, or it could go all the way up to 2 to 3 weeks. I don't know, it depends on the stock, and I'm still waiting on a reply on that one. Hopefully it won't be really long, but you just never know with these things. So obviously, if that's going to take a while, I still need to calibrate it and reset it up to make sure it's performing properly, even if it arrives really quickly. So that's going to take time. So with all that considered, we're maybe going to have to rethink some of the plans for this build. So if I can't get it up really soon, cutting properly again, then maybe I'm going to have to switch over to doing a more manual type mod. But in itself, that's going to be an interesting challenge, so I guess we'll see how that goes. I'll keep you updated on the community tab even when I do get a fix. I would really hope that I can get it sorted sooner rather than later, because it's going to have a bit of a knock-on effect with the other projects as well. But fingers crossed, and we'll see how that goes. Of course, whilst you're here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because that is easily the best way to stay up to date with the project, and of course all the tutorials and other info we've got coming up in future videos. Of course, you can also find us over on Facebook, builds.gg, Instagram and Twitter. Also, don't forget to check out our Discord server linked below. It's a great community, and I'd love to hear more from you about your projects and other things going on as well in the tech world. Of course, if you'd like to support the channel, also remember to pop by our merchandise store, also linked below. Take care, folks, and I'll catch you next time.